Okay, right. Okay, guys. Here we are going to look at FluentAPI. We are continuing our lesson with FluentAPI. We're just going to do a. We're gonna try to go through as much as we can and use as many methods of FluentAPI to configure our model so that we can map uh, the entities of our model with the underlying database with all the configurations the way we want it to look like. So we said a model is basically a collection of entities. That means you're going to define the types that you would want to actually map with your database. Now we have done that in this application. Here are the types that are going to map with our database. These are called entities, but they are just POCO types for now until you add them into or register them inside a type that inherits from DB context. Then they become entities. So the entity framework provides several ways, or let me say 3 ways to actually map these entities with your underlying database. Does that make sense? One of the ways, it's the way that the framework gives you on the outset. It's conventions. It's called conventions. So those, they are defined by the framework. So you can change those configurations because you may necessarily not need those configurations. You may want to customize the way your entities map with your underlying database. So now it's either you use attribute based configuration. With attribute based configuration, it's when you use the data annotations such as timestamp, which will configure your property with concurrency check and database generated pattern equals to computed and database generated pattern. So it's either you can change or modify or customize the way your entities map with your underlying database using these data annotations, or you can use the FluentAPI. FluentAPI is more flexible, and there are a lot of configurations that you can do with FluentAPI that you will not be able to do with data annotations. But for most cases, I believe that data annotations can just do the job. But the FluentAPI one has proven to be very flexible. So how do you configure your model with using FluentAPI? FluentAPI, we said it's basically a set of methods that are defined within this type, the model builder. So this type defines a set of methods that you can use to configure your entities. So we call those methods collectively as FluentAPI. For example, here we have called hasDefaultSchema, which is basically a method that is going to set the default schema for your database to the string that you provide as the parameter to that method. By default, the schema, the database schema, is DBO. You'll find that when you go to your SQL server, you'll find you have DBO dot the name of the table, DBO dot the name. That DBO, it's a database. It's what we call a database object. It's what is called a schema. So you can change that, or you can change the name of that schema to something like sales, depending maybe on what you want to call it. But here we call it sales. So now all our entities that will map to the database that will be used by this database context, all of those tables will have sales as their default schema. So on the next line of code, we select the entity office assignment, and then we call the method has key, which basically configures the primary key of this entity. And here we select the instructor ID. If you can go to assignment office, for example, let's jump to assignment office. It has a public property called instructor ID. So we set this as the primary key. Now that instructor ID will appear as a primary key on our database. Then here we select department, and we also call the key. But here we create a composite key. That means the key is going to be made up of two columns, and those columns here, it's the department ID and name. If you can go to department again, you'll find that it has those two department ID and name. So the primary key would be between these two properties. So these are some of the few methods that are available with FluentAPI that you can use to configure your model. So basically here what you are doing is to actually change the way your database would normally appear if you were not using FluentAPI. Your database was going to use the convention if you had not defined, if you had not used FluentAPI and the annotations to annotate all your entities or the properties of your entities. It was going to use the default configurations. But with FluentAPI, you are able to override those convention configurations. So here, let's do a few things again. The next thing that I want us to do is to basically change some of the stuff. That's just simple things. Let's say maybe we don't want a column to you see these properties, they become the columns of the table that will be called departments, né? But let's say we don't want this property to actually be part or to be a column in the table of our database. How do we do that using FluentAPI? Here's what we do. We're going to call model builder.select the entity that contains the property that we want not to map to a column on the table of our database. Does that make sense? Yeah. So here we want department. Department is the department, and then we're going to say property because we want to select a property there. Let's give the name of the property that we want. Property is budget. Budget, that's the property that we want. So we say ignore, because when we say ignore, oh, what am I doing? Ignore. Okay, you know what, I have a problem here. Let's say ignore. Let's say ignore. No, that's not how to do this thing. Supposed to call ignore here, and then select the property that you want to ignore. You don't select the property and say ignore. No. The property that we want to ignore here is budget. So now budget will not be a column of department. There won't be a column called budget because we said it has to be ignored. Only the other properties of this department entity are going to map with the columns of a table called department. This is just what you can do with FluentAPI. What else can we do here? Let's do other as column name, Cool. So let's say we want to change the name of the column in our table. Ne? We'll use department again, and then we say has column name, we want to change oh, here this is what we have to do. Okay, property, and then we select the property, then that we want, we say name. So this property was going to be a column. There was going to be a column called name, but that's not what we want. So we're going to change that and say has column name. We change that column to be department name rather than just name. So now we say department name. So now a table called departments in our database will have a column called department name instead of just name, which name is the name of the property of our POCO type. So here you use FluentAPI to configure this model. You are changing the way your model is going to look like. I mean, you are changing the way the underlying database is going to look like compared with the entities that actually define that underlying database. Does that make sense? See you in the next lesson.